Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in our Soil to Sea series at AFBI. And in this series, we focus on the environmental sustainability, protecting and enhancing of our freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems. And the series aligns with one of AFBI's key science themes in terms of enhancing natural and the marine environment. The sustainable management and protection and enhancement of the marine is vital to the prosperity and growth of the Northern Ireland economy and social well-being. And AFBI science is primarily in support of the agri-food sectors, and particularly the agriculture and fishing. But the wider impact of environmental science means that our work is increasing supporting other sectors too. AFBI delivers on a unique integrated program of research spanning soil to sea, from an in-depth understanding of soil biogeochemical processes to catchment scales responses to land use change, to the impact of climate change, to human and contaminant pressures on seas and natural resources, and to the ecosystem-based assessment of fisheries. We have an excellent instrument research platform and scientific staff expertise that's supported by DERA, the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, that provides us with the capacity to deliver on a program of research towards an holistic agri-food and environmental system-based approach. In this, in the first webinar in the series, we focus on soil to catchment management of agriculture nutrients at farm level. The second webinar looked at the impact of the environment, nutrient loading, and other human pressures on life in rivers and lakes. And today we continue our soil to sea journey to coastal areas in the sea. We have three excellent presentations today highlighting the science at AFBI in support of an holistic approach towards the sustainable management of the marine environment and natural resources. Dr. Heather Moore, a catchment and aquaculture science expert, will provide an overview of the development of an application of coastal catchment modeling in Northern Ireland and the use of ecosystem service as a tool for nutrient management. Dr. Adam Mellor, the program lead for oceanography and limnology science research within AFBI, will present an outline on the ongoing marine environmental monitoring work undertaken by AFBI, and will demonstrate the importance of environmental monitoring for coastal ecosystem understanding and environmental resilience, and how this forms the evidence base to support decision-making in response to environmental challenges in fisheries management. And then the third presentation will be delivered by Dr. Matthew Lundy, who is the program lead for marine fisheries science within AFBI, and his talk will focus on nutrients in support of the entire marine food web, and how this holistic understanding can be applied to support the sustainable management of our fisheries resources within an ecosystem context. There will be an opportunity at the end of each presentation for questions, and at the end of all the presentations, we'll have a panel discussion where the three presenters will be joined by Dr. Matthew Service, who's the program lead for marine ecology and coastal sciences within AFBI. And at this stage, I would like to draw your attention to the question and answer input box at the bottom right of your screen. And please submit questions at any time during the webinar. And if we do not have enough time to answer all your questions, we will come back to you with answers after the webinar. So without further ado, I will hand over to Heather for her presentation.
So, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see my first slide. As PJ, thank you, PJ, for the kind words of introduction. And yes, I'm going to talk about the coastal catchment modelling and ecosystem services provided by cultured shellfish in Northern Ireland. So basically, you're going to say, well, how do those two things link up? And I'm going to show you that over the next 15, 20 minutes. So basically, we have a large shellfish industry in Northern Ireland, and it's mainly mussels and oysters, and they're growing in our sheltered sea lochs and bays. And whole idea of ecosystem modelling began about 15 years ago within AFBI, because we are responsible for the sustainable development of the industry within Northern Ireland, and we realised we needed a series of tools and models to help us to achieve this goal. Slides just not moving on. So, as I say, the primary goal of the ecosystem modelling at this stage within AFBI was to look at carrying capacity. And we did this by producing the SMILE model for sustainable mariculture in Northern Irish loch ecosystems. And this model is made up of 3 different components. It's made up of the hydrodynamic component, which was using Del3D model, and individual shellfish group models are also fed into the ecological platform in the centre of this modelling framework. And we need a series of environmental data to actually provide the inputs for the hydrodynamic models, the individual shellfish models, and the ecological models. So this carrying capacity framework was the basis of the ecosystem models as we have them today. One of the important things to realise here is that bivalves are filter feeders, and filter feeders basically clear water. So as well as clearing water, they take in phytoplankton as their food, and they take in other particulate matter. So as you can see in this top tank, we've got tanks with mussels and empty tanks. And after about 52 minutes, if you've enough mussels in your tanks, you will have a nicely cleared tank where the mussels are. But you live in the control tank, you won't have cleared the system at all. So this is fine when you've got good water quality, and good water quality is one of the premises for high shellfish quality. But where you have declining water quality, which is prevalent around local waters and coastal waters and globally, you'll find that the shellfish take up other contaminants as well as their food. So how does the model framework help us visualize this filtration pressure in a system? Okay, so this is in the bottom graph here. I have shown you 2 runs of the model. The first run of the model is the blue dots, and that's just the baseline. So in the model, we have wild species, and we also have cultured aquaculture species. So the first blue spots are the amount of chlorophyll that's left in the system when you only have the wild species activated in the model. When you activate the aquaculture species as well, you see that there's a much lower amount of chlorophyll left within the system. So this change between the baseline and the drawdown from the aquaculture, it gives us an idea of the top-down control of bivalves in this system. And we're using chlorophyll here as a proxy for phytoplankton biomass. And we are saying from this that mussel feeding is providing a valuable ecosystem service for reducing chlorophyll A levels and suppressing eutrophication, particularly during the summer months. So this is one of the ecosystem services that we are going to talk about in more detail throughout the talk. This obviously was not just done alone with AFBI, and we have a long-standing collaboration with Portuguese and UK colleagues, which is still ongoing today with the development of these ecosystem models. So how does this fit into the holistic approach that Peter Jan discussed earlier? Well, this is a nice picture that was given to me by Adele, who works in the SWAT project, and it basically shows some of the sources that we find within the catchments that affect our coastal water bodies. And as you can see, there are sources in the catchment of agriculture, so these are diffuse sources, and forestry, and you've also got sources from industry and sources from urban sources. So they can be either modelled through drainage area models to wastewater treatment works, or they can be smaller urban catchments which would be non-modelled, or they can be septic tanks. So we're basically saying that in each catchment there's a variety of different sources of pollutants, and we want to look at how you can model these catchment sources and how they can be rooted down into our coastal water bodies. And when, of course, they come into coastal water bodies, whether that be by infiltration through the soil into the groundwater, or by direct diffuse inputs, or by inputs through the streams, they can impact on our bivalves and our fisheries. And we're going to further out impacts in oceanography, and you'll hear a bit more about that in the next 2 talks. So these pictures at the side are just to remind us of some of the land use that's typical in Northern Ireland and the land management practices. And also to have a quick look at some, this is just in the Dundrum catchment, which you'll hear a little bit more detail about later. These are the wastewater treatment units, and these are the septic tanks in all these spots. So there's a lot of different inputs from our catchments to our seas, so from soil to sea, that we have to consider. And how do we go about doing this? We go about doing this by what we've called a multi-model cascade. So we have a variety of different models that link together, and we put a variety of inputs into those to help model what's happening from the catchment down to the sea. So the first model that we have in this series is the SWAT model, the Soil Water Assessment Tool. It's a terrestrial eco-hydrology model, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute or two. And it relies on atmospheric boundary inputs, so meteorological data and climate data. Obviously, rain is one of the major factors here, and a very big factor in Northern Ireland, I'm sure you'll all agree. So the water that's routed through this hydrological model feeds into the DELF 3D model, which is our hydrodynamic model, so for coastal hydrodynamics. And this model also takes inputs from oceanographic or regional sea models, and these have an impact on the outputs from the DELF 3D model. The DELF 3D model outputs feed into the ecological model, which in this case is EcoWin model, and it's a coastal biogeochemistry model. This is a picture of foil, and the pink polygons are the shellfish areas within the foil, within Loch Foyle, and these other boxes are the EcoWin boxes. So basically, the whole idea is that you couldn't possibly compute at this very fine grid level of DELF 3D to look at numerous different scenarios that we want to look at. So you make bigger model boxes in the EcoWin box. The other input to the ecological model comes directly from the SWAT model, and this is nutrients, dissolved in organic nitrogen, phosphorus, sediments, and particulate organic matter. And within the ecological model, we can look at nutrient or substance balances, we can look at primary production, and we can look at aquaculture yield. And this multi-model cascade is known as the SUCCESS framework, and that's a system for understanding carrying capacity, ecological and social sustainability. So just a little bit more detail about the SWAT model and what it can do. So the SWAT model, or the Soil Water Assessment Tool, is broken down, takes the catchment and breaks it down into a series of sub-basins. So each sub-basin around a river will feed into that river or that stream. And these are called hydrological response units, or HRUs, and they're made up of the slope, the soils, and the land use. So we are looking at two different phases in the SWAT model. The first one is the land phase, and that computes what happens in each of these different hydrological response units. So we take into account the vegetation, the nutrient cycling, and the hydrology, and how this is routed down into the streams. This is obviously massively affected by different human management, so land use management within these different catchments, and obviously also the climate. The land phase then feeds into the routing phase. This is where all the hydrological unit outputs are added at a sub-basin level, and the sub-basins are routed through the catchment and down to the coastal waters. So you can have discharges again from industry, you can have processes that are happening within lakes and reservoirs, and processes that are happening in industry and transformations. A lot of the information covered in earlier webinars on soils and the freshwater environments are very important here. The next slide just gives a little bit more detail on the hydrodynamic model and the transport that happens within this model. So basically, it calculates currents and transport using salinity and temperature. And as you can see in the offshore grids, it's a much coarser grid. And as you come inshore, you get a much more high resolution grid. This is just a service grid here. There are at least 8 layers in this hydrodynamic model. And we need inputs from regional sea models to provide boundary conditions to push the water fluxes through these grids and into our sea locks and our bays. So this just gives you a bit of an idea of the bathymetry, the bottom roughness, and the temperature and salinity parameters that are required to make these current profiles from the hydrodynamic model. And what can this model do? This model can look at plume dispersal and decay modelling in the DELF water quality module. And it can look at the movement of bacteria throughout the systems. And it also provides inputs to the ecological model, which are very important. So how do all of these different models fit together? So they're coupled in what we call the coastal catchment modelling or ecosystem catchment modelling. And as you can see in this slide, to the left-hand side, we have the climatic inputs, so mainly rainfall. And we've presently got this model running in a 10-year model cycle, and running at an hourly time step, which is a big change for the SWAT model, which usually runs at a daily time step. We take into account, as we said, all the different factors in the SWAT model, which is here, and this can look at the differences between nutrient and bacterial source apportionment within the catchment, and the results for these lead into individual, and the results can be looked at in the individual sub-basins of the SWAT model. We have a much improved data set on the human management factor for these catchments, and we also, and the most novel part of these ecosystem catchment models are that we now include the drainage area models. So wastewater, where the wastewater is coming from within the catchment. This looks at wastewater treatment works, it looks at septic tanks, it looks at CSOs, or confined storm overflows, and this is rooted into the stream model. So that rooting phase of the SWAT model. And the streams then obviously flow down to the coastal waters, and so we are getting nutrient loads and other contaminant loads, including emerging contaminants, into the coastal waters. So the reason for having the schematic here as well is just to bring your attention to the fact that not only do diffuse sources feed directly into the coastal waters, but also wastewater does too. And this is just to give us an idea of how the different linkages and couplings of the variety of models that we've talked about today link together. And I can go into this in more detail later if anybody would like. The other most important thing here is that as computer capacity has increased, we have now got the ability to look at big data sets from sensors and from different satellite systems and everything else, and feed these into these models, which is a very important transformation within the modelling setup that we have now. So what can you do with these models? The SWAT model can look, as we say, can differentiate between agriculture and urban inputs from the catchment, and we call this source apportionment. This was first looked at in the Foyle catchment during the SMILE model, during the time of the SMILE model. And as you can see here, we have different, the main sources of nitrogen in the catchment to be put down to the pasture. And we then look at the phosphorus in the catchment, and the main sources here for both diffuse and point sources. So looking at rangeland and pasture, but also quite a lot from wastewater treatment works feeding directly into the loch. There's a little bit here also of wastewater treatment works feeding into the streams. They would be routed down through the SWAT model and into the loch again that way. Looking at particulate organic matter, we see that there's much more source apportionment to the diffuse sources, so pasture and rangeland again, and less to the wastewater treatment works. So the take-home message from this is that source apportionment of nutrient loads is key for policy decisions, and source control in systems such as rock soil is complex, costly, and socially challenging. The more recent work we've done on the Dundrum catchment, which is this little catchment here, hasn't been analysed yet for nutrients, but we've looked at it for source apportionment of bacteria in the catchment. And as you can see, the size of the pie chart is indicative of the amount of E. coli coming from that part of the catchment. And these are the main sources of urban inputs within the catchment and diffuse inputs within the catchment. And as you can see, in the sub-basin 4 and sub-basin 10, we're getting a much greater input from urban than we are from rural. Whereas in 1 and 3, we're getting a much greater rural input than we are urban. This is very typical, and this is not unexpected because we have one wastewater treatment works in sub-basin 4 and another one in sub-basin 10. But it's still it still gives us an indication of where the main sources are within the catchments. And this helps us to focus our attention on where we would put extra investment in the catchment going forward. This model output is just showing us the ecological model again. And again, it's from Loch Foyle, so it's the work done during SMILE. And as you can see, we have run the model and we've looked at the changes in chlorophyll that you can find in the different areas of the sea loch. And the biggest drawdown that we found was in the central and the upper parts of the loch, where there's both native oyster and blue mussel cultivation. So the top-down control is more obvious in areas where there's more intense aquaculture. So that's okay to think about, but how can you conceptualize the idea that bivalves are useful in mitigating against symptoms of eutrophication? So if you look at this diagram here, you can see that as nitrogen and phosphorus is fed into the system, you get the primary symptoms of eutrophication. And if these are left unchecked and excessive nutrients come into the system, you will lead to secondary symptoms of eutrophication, which are usually problematic, like hypoxia and harmful algal blooms. However, if we add bivalves into the system, they act as a circuit breaker and they stop the deterioration of the water quality going as far as the secondary symptoms of eutrophication by the top-down control that we've just discussed. So how do we bring all of these things together? How do we've looked at the idea of the catchment and the sources from within the catchment and how they're routed down through the catchment and how they affect things in the coastal waters. That can be bathing waters, protected shellfish waters, or other designated features. But the other aspect of this model is how can we look at more localized farm scale level in the model. And we use the farm aquaculture source management tool here, which was part of the schematic that I showed you earlier. And it looks at the amount of food and detritus that are taken in by bivalves in bivalve aquaculture, and then how much comes out. So we're looking at the mass balance. We're looking at the amount of carbon that goes in, then how it's filtered out by the shellfish, and then the amount of carbon that's left within after this filtration process. So phytoplankton detritus removal, mass balance, and how this affects eutrophication. So we build to be able to do a sum of mass balance, you need to have an idea of how shellfish actually feed. And we use net energy balance models for this. So this basically balances the uptake and the losses during shellfish feeding. And so we have developed within our system, within all of our systems actually, individual shellfish models. So these are the individual base models for the different commercial species and for some of the species of commercial interest. And we were able to put numbers onto the energy inputs and the energy outputs to look at the intakes and the losses. And we were able to use this to calculate a mass balance. So the mass balance equation that I've put here is actually from Ria Formosa, and that is taking the phytoplankton removal in carbon and the detritus removal in carbon, and we equate this to the amount of nitrogen that that's equivalent to, and we do a mass balance sum. So the mass balance sum here equates to 8,748 population equivalents. So basically, by putting bivalve aquaculture into Ria Formosa, you can remove the equivalent amount of nitrogen that you would need a small wastewater treatment works to remove otherwise. So the whole idea of nutrient trading hasn't really taken off in Europe as such at the moment. However, it is really, the nutrient crediting is actually really important over in the USA. And throughout the Horizon 2020 GAIN project, which is green aquaculture intensification in Europe, we work with colleagues in the US and in Portugal, and we have been looking at the idea of producing a white paper where we look at the idea of introducing nutrient trading to help with the offsets against eutrophication. So obviously ecosystem services provided by shellfish, whether they be cultivated shellfish or whether they be wild species, or whether they be restoration species, in fact, it doesn't matter which, are just one of the many nature-based solutions and ecosystem services that will help with mitigating against the forms of eutrophication caused by too many nutrients coming down through our environment, our catchments. So in summary, and some ideas for future work, the concept of considering water as a continuum and our need to capture the atmospheric, freshwater and marine elements to model and understand the interaction is demonstrated in our ecosystem models. Our ecosystem models help to determine the sources of pollution, how they impact on our coastal waters, and how the investment is best made going forward to achieve even further improvements in water quality. Coastal catchment models are currently being developed for over 33% of the land cover in Northern Ireland, and they allow management and policy decisions to be made for terrestrial systems affecting both freshwater and marine. The mass balance approach has helped to put nutrient loading and shellfish offsets in perspective. The key regulatory ecosystem service is not nutrient removal, but mitigation of eutrophication symptoms. The take-home message that I would give from my talk today is that what we do in land, so that's our societal choices, not only have an impact on the nearshore coastal waters, but also on the offshore domains, which both Adam and Matt will tell you more about in the next two talks. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening today.
Thanks very much, Heather. Just a reminder to attendees to please submit questions if you have some. Heather, a question came in here to asking how would you apply these models in management decisions of coastal catchments?
Thank you, PJ. Okay, so we can use the ecosystem models to compare the hard-built solutions against nature-based solutions by running a different number of scenarios. And this would probably be the best way to look at the idea of management decisions. I mean, I suppose the most important thing is if you can focus where the sources are from a catchment, where you need to focus your investment, you can decide what is the best way forward. So whether that be a nature-based solution or nature-based solutions in conjunction with some hard-built solutions, you can possibly save money that way. Again, this comes down to society as well, but that can be considered within the scenarios that we run in the model.
Thank you, Heather. We'll come back with further questions during the panel discussion. I am going to hand over to Dr. Adam Mellor now for his presentation.
Hello, good morning. Sorry if you're unable to see me. We've had a few technical challenges this morning. Hopefully you can hear me. And I'm going to continue this story following on the theme of soil to sea. So understanding the flow and fate of nutrients, carbon, and of course contaminants, and our water quality and our oceanography. And give you an overview of some of the monitoring strategies with a few examples along the way. So to use a phrase of a colleague that came up during discussions yesterday, where societally we're faced with a number of challenges that the scale is so big in terms of food production, waste, and the problems associated with climate change. We're at a stage where we probably just can't engineer a solution to build on top of the environment. And our strategy has always been really to try and better understand our interaction with the environment and how we can live as part of it. So in this presentation, I'd like to illustrate our approach or our strategy, to give it a more formal term, and be able to describe how we start to understand our nutrient and carbon flows, how this impacts on our fisheries and resource management. Also the effects that we have for conservation, because in the marine realm we're dealing with a wild resource or a semi-wild resource, and then also to look at some of the pressures associated with climate change and how those are affecting us in our coastal zone. And our strategy has always been largely to identify those science and policy requirements, and then to bring in a very much a focused, targeted and smart monitoring activities that then lead into sort of more advanced analytics and modelling that give us this better understanding of process and environment. Heather has really dealt, and I think our next presenter, Matt, will be talking about some of this synthesis and the modelling that helps support these management decisions and the further understanding. And what I'll be looking at more in this presentation is about our data generation and the analytics to understand process. So oceanography provides us with that baseline of environmental information that's essential to sustainably utilise and exist within our environment. But it's also providing that baseline of information for our models. Excuse me. And one way that we're doing this is by deploying moored instrumentation at sentinel locations. And these can send in quite high resolution time series. As you can see from the inset panel, there's a number of stations around the Northern Irish coast that are telemetering data at quite high resolution. Those, of course, are complemented for us to get that third dimension of space on top of time by surveys using our research vessel, the Christie's, and you can see a typical survey grid there on the main panel. And increasingly, we're starting to look at the adoption of some of the more modern technologies in terms of autonomous vehicles, both gliding powered and surface autonomous vehicles, to actually deliver that extra dimension of data. And why are we doing this? Well, in essence, it's so we can understand, this slide obviously highlights on the carbon cycle, but looking at nutrients, our nitrogen, our phosphorus, it's be able to understand the coupling between our terrestrial environment, the aquatic environment, our rivers, lakes, all the way down to our coastal cities and the oceans, and of course the atmospheric interaction that completes that loop is a very important link, and one that we need to be considering in understanding process and taking that into the models. So all of our activity is certainly within sight, if not coordinated, under an umbrella partnership that AFBI was instrumental in setting up, which is the United Kingdom Integrated Marine Observing Network, which is an established partnership of the principal marine research organisations in the United Kingdom, as well as the Met Office, both in the UK and of course in Ireland, and the broader connections to our European neighbours. The lessons learned then, to give one simple example of what our strategy has led us to find, is that observational programs, of course, can meet the needs of compliance monitoring without being correct. And this is a risk that we need to mitigate by actually the strategy to develop our understanding rather than just tick the boxes of thresholds. So I'm going to, if I can just get that slide to move on, give you one quick example from the Coyle estuary, which in Northern Ireland is an impounded estuary, and was one of the first locations that we put a monitoring buoy about 19 years ago on the inshore network to help us understand the processes involved there with nutrient enrichment and the eutrophic impacts, and of course the subsequent fish kills. And although the enriched nature of this environment was well understood, even with enhanced traditional sampling techniques, in this case sampling every week, we can see some of the oxygen production from the eutrophic effects of algal enrichment here on the left-hand side of this plot. But we're not seeing so many of the deleterious effects until we really overlay that on the moored instrument data. And here then we can see this episodic and sometimes quite continued hypoxia and anoxia that was leading to fish kills. What we didn't really appreciate we would find out until we started to analyze the data that we were generating from high resolution data sets is the fact that we could identify different mechanisms for this hypoxia. In this case, we could see DL swings of oxygen resulting from the excess phytoplankton in the systems feeding on these nutrients, so a biological initiator. But then we also started to discover the rarer but a lot more persistent hydrological initiator, where the stratification was broken down by rainwater flow, exposing sediments, their chemical and biological oxygen demand, stripping the oxygen out and causing quite major fish kills. So these processes were really what we were starting to understand as a result of our monitoring strategy. That was a Sentinel time series developed by instrumentation, accompanied by the survey work to understand the spatial context. So scaling this up into the Irish Sea, we've had a mooring in this location certainly for nearly 25 years, across a suite of physical and chemical parameters. So to come back to our theme of nutrients, it really is about understanding those dynamics of the Irish Sea. So the Irish Sea relies implicitly, well, the Western Irish Sea, on the thermal stratification that sets up sometime between April through to September. And this is where you can see through the winter months when these temperature lines are all very consistent. We've got a well-mixed water column. And then thermal stratification occurs through this period, providing structure to the water column. And this is the main control of primary productivity, water flow and water movement, and of course, implicit effects on both the wild stocks as well as the commercially fished stocks that are in this area. As you can see from the inset panel, we've got around 25 years of data at this location now, which is really starting to give us a lot of interest in terms of measuring any changes in the timings of the onset and breakdown of this stratification, the duration, and of course the strength of the stratification. And why is this important in this story of land to sea or soil to sea? Well, we can see a very rapid depletion of the nutrients with the algal bloom that comes on when this stratification sets up. And this gives us an insight into the dynamics and the nutrient and carbon flows of the area. So again, we can relate this back to fisheries as well as the broader ecosystem effects, which really is answering the so what question. Why do we have so much interest in this area? And it is largely because of the stratification and its resilience to the potential changes that we're going to see through climate change that will affect the success of our fishery stocks, our fisheries, our conservation designations, and of course, broader global processes where this is a great exemplar of a seasonally stratified water body and how it responds to increases in temperature or changes in the wind climate that we're going to be expecting. One good example of where we are relating these changes to climate change is by looking at the plankton. And as part of a partnership across the UK, again, you can see here on the main map, there are the Irish sea moorings that AFBI manages, as well as significant number of moorings in Scotland and England between Plymouth and Seafass, allowing us to take a regional scale picture and developing statistical techniques that allowed us to get past the differences created by sampling regime or the variability associated with time and space, and actually look for regional scale changes at the foundation of our food chain. And it was only really at the start of this year that we've started to confidently, using these indicators, identify changes at the foundation of the food chain. So changes in the functional groups, the composition of these functional groups of primary producers and indeed our zooplankton that will have knock-on effects for our ecosystem. And I think this will be one of our principal focuses in the very near future of understanding what these changes might mean. Back to our ecosystem approach, we move from the bottom of the food chain to the top of the food chain. So as part of our oceanographic program, we've also tried to encompass some research into our top grazers and our top predators in the marine mammals. And that's by developing an acoustic program alongside our oceanographic program over the last 10 to 12 years. This is carried out in coordination with our long-term monitoring, also in parallel to our tracking of salmonid and other fish, and of course underway measurements whilst we're doing things like our herring stocks. And it provides an assessment of the vocalizing species as well as the wider acoustic environment. So with support from our policy sponsors and also from European interests, we've been able to expand this network not only within the Northern Irish domain, but more regionally within the Scottish and Irish, and start to get a real understanding of some of the abundance and the patterns associated with these animals. The plot that you're looking at here, there's probably a lot of noise and a lot of data here really to go into too much detail, but it's just to illustrate some of the data that we're getting from one of our longer term monitoring sites in the Western Irish Sea, showing our porpoise and dolphin detection at this location at numbers that we previously thought would be expected. And this is possibly because there's a lot of bias traditionally associated with marine mammal monitoring, as it has used visual techniques from platforms that are typically on land, but when they're at sea, the repeated measures mean there's an observer bias towards certain areas. And what we're starting to find now is that it's likely that there are actually some significant overwintering areas in certain areas of the sea. Certainly more offshore, where we hadn't appreciated that it was before in the case of the harbour porpoise. And these patterns are being seen around the Northern Irish coast, and it's quite hot off the press what we're starting to establish and investigate here. So coming back to our ocean climate, having touched on a couple of ecosystem components, I think it would be fair to say that Northern Ireland is relatively poorly prepared for the challenges associated with sea level rise, as you can see here on the panel on the left, and also the predicted increase in the significant wave height experienced along the eastern Irish coastline, both of which are going to impact our coastal systems on both the marine and the terrestrial systems. So in response to this, along with DARE, AFBI first deployed the first wave rider as part of the UK WaveNet network just last year, or sorry, yes, 2019, September 2019. This mooring is now deploying or delivering data operationally to a publicly accessible platform where you can explore wave and meteorological observations from around the UK and Irish waters, and is also delivering data to our Irish neighbours Marine Institute platform as well. So it's quite a collaborative effort. And as you can see here down on the bottom right of the panel, the Met Office and their modelling capacity are involved in terms of what we now have as an extended 5-day forecast. And in this case, we've overlaid the observations with it. So it's not only contributing to the modelling effort, but allowing us to validate the effectiveness of the modelling. Having looked at the pressures in terms of the wave climate and continuing our longer term monitoring there, we also need to look at what those pressures affect, which principally will be our coastline, both habitats as well as our physical infrastructure. So in the image here, you can see an aerial shot of a beach on the Ards Peninsula with some decidedly dry looking sand and some wet looking sand. And one of the things that the project that we're working on here has really led us to focus on is indeed this groundwater influence on our coastal substrate. So by mapping the depth of our groundwater across this area, we can then interpolate and model where we have groundwater close to the surface. This has a number of potential impacts, both mobilizing sediment, making it more prone to erosion, but also in terms of the transport of nutrients, contaminants, and bacteria, and as a coastal biogeochemical resource. And when we expand that further through to the panel on the right by using some geostatistical modelling, we can really start to look at areas of risk from both erosion as well as the groundwater penetration. Another way that we've been looking at this is again by taking remote imagery, so quite often satellite imagery, and applying machine learning processes to do land use classification. And then with that panel on the right, by understanding the groundwater processes and the diffuse inputs to our coastal domain, we're identifying spots where we can deploy equipment. In this case, the trace along the bottom is a small pressure logger. And with that, we can start to relate our wave environment, the pressures, to our actual groundwater environment. So the pressure coming from the land and the pressure from the sea, and understanding the impacts of tide, of increased waves from storm events, and of course rainfall on our groundwater level, mobilizing the sediments. So the impact of this, going back to our one of our first slides here, really comes through our modelling approach that Heather's given us a lot of detail in on that previous presentation. And one of the areas that we're applying this now, and this is a project that I'm just beginning to start to get more involved with, is the Living with Water programme, which is a Northern Ireland water programme, a massive infrastructure investment designed for the Greater Belfast catchment to help protect against flood risk and to enhance the natural environment. And these are very much targets that are affecting how we live. It's affecting planning in terms of where we live, and really reflects the fact that we need to increase our understanding with this approach rather than just try and engineer more capacity. So it's about understanding the effect of nutrient flow, of volumes of water and catchments on those actual receptors rather than just channeling everything down a pipeline. And as you can see here, the project is taking into use or taking into the model a lot of the principles that Heather has already touched on, our land use across the catchment, bringing in the hydrological models, and then also bringing in the water utilities infrastructure in terms of where those inputs of processed water come into the environment, so we can actually understand what the receptor is, what the fate, and see how best to model, and then to actually build solutions to actually allow us to live in this space. And again, we use this blended technique of real-time, quite dense sentinel site observations. So there will be monitoring stations in rivers, in channels, in sewage networks that are delivering data to this model, as well as the survey work that's going out across the rivers and the marine endpoints to really inform and start to give us a much more informed assessment of how this catchment responds to increases in inputs or improvements in infrastructure. And that brings us back a little bit to where we were talking about groundwater and the sediments. There's these synergies between some of the areas that we're looking at here, and that interaction of that groundwater in terms of our habitats, in terms of bacteria and the effect on, for example, bathing waters, and of course the biogeochemical processes that are happening in this groundwater marine interface will probably have some quite interesting implications for our wastewater sector. Tied in alongside that is a new DARA-backed research program we're just launching now on contaminants of emerging concern. We're looking at antimicrobials and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and their residues and their byproducts that are coming through our wastewater system. And what are their effects on the aquatic and marine life? And this is bringing in both our freshwater limnology teams as well as our chemists, as well as our modelers indeed, to help understand these processes and their fates. So the impacts of the combined observations along with modeling are really quite high, and we've got quite substantial opportunities within AFBI because of the breadth of scientific expertise from land use right through to our aquatic scientists. So we can look at the optimizing those benefits of infrastructure development. We can look at our coastal erosion and where it's sensible or where we have to adopt different strategies from merely coastal reinforcement and defending the line, as they call it, to perhaps a managed retreat from areas that are going to be under more pressure. And we can also look at our land management practices and how those impact our water quality and our networks. And this really is about coming back to this coherent approach, this ecosystem approach of understanding how the nutrients are moving from land to sea, how we're then evolving oxygen or absorbing carbon dioxide, supporting fisheries and these species that are of conservation concern. And those are really the intelligent outputs of our monitoring efforts, where we want to be at. So I'm going to draw a line under it there and probably close, and thank you all for your attention. And hopefully I can pass you back over to Peter Yan.
Thanks very much, Adam. Adam, question be submitted here on the, your environmental monitoring program and the whole concept of digital environment and using smart technology. So is the maintenance of an autonomous observation platform more cost effective than traditional monitoring technique and using the likes of smart sensors?
That's a fair question, and I think the cost effectiveness would have to be measured in terms of what we can gain from it. So in simple economics, it isn't always cheaper, but as I tried to illustrate with a fairly acute example, our traditional monitoring techniques won't always inform us about process and give us the data that really helps us to understand systems. So I think by using targeted technology, remote deployed technology, which we have to acknowledge is expensive and does need maintenance, but using that at specific sites to answer specific questions, I think we can then learn an awful lot more and maintain some of our broader, what might be perceived as cheaper, although I'm not necessarily convinced as that, but our broader techniques can be deployed in cahoots. But I think the synergies between the organizations responsible for monitoring, whether that's the water infrastructure, the DARA, the regulator, ourselves as science providers, is one key area where we stand to make things more cost effective.
Adam, another question in terms of what is the predictive scale of coastal loss and flooding, and is this really an issue in Northern Ireland?
Okay, now I wouldn't like to put a number on the scale on the spot here, but our predictions, and these are not AFBI's predictions, the climate change predictions, bringing in really the best scientific evidence globally and of course within the UK, are that we will experience over the next 60 to 80 years significant increase in our relative sea level, something that we've only over the last 10 to 15 years begun to appreciate, that our isostatic rebound isn't as great as previously presumed. And of course, this increased wave climate and the potential for that to erode the coast. So our infrastructure is already struggling. And one area that DARA and DFI are already very active in is developing the policies to actually support this and start to plan longer term in terms of where is a good idea to invest in infrastructure and where might be an idea to perhaps retreat from, because we're only going to be stalling briefly those erosion processes. So it's a fairly new project for both DARA and AFBI, and I think we're going to see some quite interesting outputs from it in terms of how that affects our decisions for infrastructure and development.
Thanks very much, Adam. We'll come back to some of the other questions during the panel discussion. Next, I'm going to hand over to Matthew Lundy for his presentation.
Good morning, folks, and I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, you can probably see me and see my slides. I'm going to attempt to convey some of the work that we've been doing within AFBI to move to integrating these environmental factors and ecosystem understanding toward fisheries management. It's a large body of work, but we're going to take a recent case study and some work that we've been developing with colleagues within the branch as a whole, within the marine fisheries section, but also with institutes across Europe and colleagues from different parts of the fisheries community, the fisheries science community. For many of us, when we think of fisheries management, it'll be focused on the idea of setting catch limits or technical measures for including mesh sizes or gear restrictions. But fisheries management in the modern world, in the current and in the future, is going to have principles such as sustainability to ensure that when we're talking about fisheries management, we're looking at long-term environmental sustainability whilst maintaining precautionary catch limits on harvested stocks. looking at how we're incorporating those ecosystem functions and ecosystem understanding into our management of fisheries. Thankfully, heavily, this will be focused on the scientific evidence and how we influence policy and change those management decisions to make sure that they're the best for our system. But also there'll be targets such as reducing discards through those technical measures such as limiting unwanted bycatch. For ourselves today, we're going to look very much into this understanding of trying to implement this ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. It is a term that is well used. It's a concept. Its definition, however, is quite broad, and I'm sure there are a lot of different avenues that one could take to achieve it. For a lot of this work, we'll be focusing on the ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of Seas workshop series that was supporting a lot of the work that I'm currently going to speak of today, and that was a 5-year process looking at a number of meetings. It started with a scoping exercise, engaging environmental groups, stakeholders, fisheries stakeholders, scientists, to really look at the questions that and try to address some of the concerns, questions, and issues within the IRC. Then moving into more of the fundamentals of how we provide advice, and that's through what we term the single stock assessments and through a benchmarking process for those assessments. Then more recently moving into the development of these ecosystem models for the IRC and the food web within it for moving beyond the single species information. And then more recently, and the latter process to really address how that could be put into a ecosystem-based fisheries management framework. So we'll step through each of these sort of ideas, these four points, covering some of them briefly, covering some of them in a bit more in depth, and then towards the end, looking at the future of the work and how we're developing on from this stepping stone of WK Irish process. So really that first scoping brought together people from a very wide range of backgrounds. And we were asking about the processes, the patterns that we were seeing within the fisheries, within the environment, within climate, within a wide range of environmental and processes. And we were trying to ask the question about which of these were the key to understand how best to manage our fishery system. So we were looking at aspects such as the mixed fishery of the Western Irish Sea, which doesn't just catch one species, but has many different species within the catch. How these overlap with different areas within technical gears. Looking at animal behavior, so suggesting maybe we don't know as much as we do about the movements, or we don't have the empirical evidence for the movements. A lot of people and our stakeholders are very knowledgeable about this and can provide the background, but to collect the evidence to support information about the movement, so potentially the migratory behavior from spawning grounds to feeding grounds of some of the fish stocks. And then looking at some of the fish community that we don't currently assess, but is still important for the system. I show a plot here coming from the AFBI groundfish survey, which shows the change in lesser spotted dogfish from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, and shows a clear development of catch rates. But it wasn't just those fish-related questions, and I've taken a liberty to borrow 2 images, one from Adam and one from Heather this morning, to really to ask questions about the environmental variables and how those may be incorporated within our fisheries management and in this wider ecosystem understanding. So looking at information such as Adam showed, the sea surface temperature that we're collecting from the mirrored instrumentation within the IRC, how that can be incorporated into the wider understanding. And then from Heather as well, how the influence from the land and the process is ongoing onshore, into the river systems and into the estuarine or coastal systems, may introduce nutrients or different even contaminants or pollutants, but in this case I've highlighted nutrients. And that very multicolored plot on the other side shows integrated trends analysis for the Irish Sea, showing how these different, we see phases for moving of different variables from the AMO or changes in different diatom communities, and indeed changes in the stock size of some of the commercially exploited stocks. So we see that there are groupings of these variables and shifting between high phases and low phases. But this was the scoping exercise, really to generate to provide the background information for what we might be using within understanding the patterns within the fish stocks that we were seeing, particularly for management. The second phase within that WK Irish process was to really address improving or getting better single stock assessments. And these are, for many people who work closely within the fishing industry and within policy of fisheries managers, will recognize these IC's advice, the annual advice process that provides the catch opportunities or the advice for catch opportunities for managers. And within WK Irish, we addressed looking at introducing new information from the fisheries or from survey information for herring, haddock, cod, plaice, and Irish sea whiting. And that was achieved, and some of those assessments are currently being used in the annual process, providing advice. But that is the fundamental building block of current fisheries management, are these advice processes. And it's not a small undertaking. It's still a large data collection process and scientific modeling to provide these understanding of fish community demographics. But there's a direction of travel, and we're moving along these to add extra information to gain a better understanding. So we're moving from those, or attempting to move from those single species stock assessments, which use population demographics and individual species parameters. And that's, whilst it looks like that's the first step in this, it's a large undertaking. It relies on survey series coming from sea, relies on the commercial fishing industry to provide data, relies on biological information collected and otolith aging from fish. It's a huge body of work, but it's the basis of what we do. From that, we step up into understanding the mixed fisheries considerations, and that's maybe still based on individual species or individual stock assessments, but looking at the fisheries patterns. What type of fishing vessel catches that stock and how many of another stock it catches. So then we can start to say, well, based on the advice for one stock, what are the implications for another when you have this mixed fisheries consideration? And that's the next step in the system. And that's where we currently are working, and these are ongoing advice that is provided. Then we move up more towards the multi-species assessment models. And that's starting to build in ideas about still those potentially mixed fisheries questions, but about how there are predator-prey interactions, how some fish eat other fish, using dietary information or stomach contents information to understand the implications for stock size of one on another stock, and the fisheries, and indeed the anthropogenic impact of the removals, the fishing. And then that last stage, the one that we're going to move on to now, is the idea of these ecosystem-based models. And those move beyond the mixed fisheries, move beyond the multi-species assessment, and start to introduce more understanding of environment and climate, anthropogenic information such as fisheries removals, but could start to move towards, or do start to move towards, marine spatial planning, the potential closed areas issues, start to include information such as marine chemistry, oceanography, and also have a much wider stock or species food web issue from primary producers to the top level predators, those being mammals, seabirds, so right through the fish community that supports that. And that's where we want to get to, and that's the drive or the direction that we want to get to, this really holistic understanding of the systems to provide the best fisheries management that still maintains a profitable, sustainable industry. Within WK Irish and working with colleagues mainly from CFAS we developed a multi-species assessment model, LMANS. It included 8 stocks, cod, haddock, whiting, plaice, herring, and 2 nephrops stocks. This type of model includes fish by body size or length, and an understanding of the selectivity of different fishing vessels or fishing gears to remove fish of different lengths. And really it moves beyond that, and that single stock advice, which is an annual process, the mixed fisheries advice, which is an annual process, towards a slightly longer term, maybe 2 to 5 to 10 year process of understanding how technology changes, how fleet changes, how stock development and growth of fish will start to change the size or the availability of stocks. So that's a model which is currently used in other sea areas and is now being developed for the Irish Sea. We then started to build a sort of a description of our ecosystem, and we used a method called EcoPath with EcoSim. This was built with colleagues primarily led by SAMS. It included 41 functional groups, so not necessarily species, but different size classes of species, or grouping mammals together into a single entity. Included primary producers, finfish, for me the point of interest, for the fisheries management the point of interest, but also seabirds and mammal groups. And the plot here, or the figure here, really starts to show the complexity of all those linkages between those 41 functional groups, where some are eating others, and then they're being removed by fishing boats and so forth. And that was to get this real ecosystem description of the current ecosystem that's going on, and introducing environment or climate drivers such as NAO into understanding how these stocks are changing. Our next step, and a model that we're building in AFBI, the Moses model, is a model for simulation. And that's taking that similar understanding of food webs, of how these, what is eating what, to look at then the causal relationships within the systems. So the Moses model is a metabolic model. Includes 159 fish species, 51 fish. And the idea at the minute is to get a balanced system. So we have all these animals living in equilibrium as if the system was unchanged. So we see here the grey line shows the starting biomass of cod if the system was the one unchanged. Then we introduce fisheries catches. This is the red line. In the middle of the system, you start to see that has an implication on the cod stock, because there's a decline in the cod. But then as the fishery removals declined, the model says the cod stock should recover. And that's because we have a static balanced system. We want to move beyond that, and that's now what we're trying to do with the understanding of the ecosystem. So we've taken that very simple single species assessment process, and we now get this food web that is built up of interactions, predator-prey relationships, and the introduction of nutrients in the system, or climate drivers. The red dot within this figure shows cod. The blue dots are its predators, and the yellow dots are its food, and then there's everything else which is just within, not directly associated with cod. And we start to get, and the size of the dot is the body size, a log scale of body size. So from that single species assessment, we're now into a complex web of understanding of the functioning of the system. But what do we do with that? And what are we starting to now introduce to understand better that climate driver or the ecosystem driver? So this is a metabolic model. It allows us to simulate change. And what we're really simulating in this is what's the influence of temperature change in the system. So we introduce a vector of temperature and also fishing pressure. So we see if you introduce just temperature as a metabolic increase. So as temperature rise, you would expect you need further metabolic demand. We see here this red line at the top, the stock stays stable, more or less. There's a little decline. So there's sufficient food within the system to meet those metabolic demands. We introduce fishing pressure in this green line. The stock stays relatively stable. It changes slightly, it drops, but it stays at this high level. The dots show how we've assessed the stock to have changed. But we introduce it as some form of additional mortality or a form of increased mortality within the system due to habitat favorability per se. And this is this purple line. So from where we have a stable system, there's sufficient food within the system, temperature is stable, the environment is stable, fishing pressure is increased from landings is increased, and the stock is shown. We would have expected it without an environmental driver to recover. We see a large decrease, much more closely reflecting the assessed stock. This is one example of how we're using this, and it's one of the key questions about how we now incorporate that environmental understanding or ecosystem understanding into the management of the fish stock. So what have we started to do? We started to take out some environmental relationships from these ecosystem models and look at their relationships with, say, the stock size. So including simple parameters such as sea surface temperature, SST, we see a strong relationship of that with the cod and whiting stock. But to also more complex ecosystem processes or food web or community indicators such as large zooplankton with herring, there's a strong relationship. And indeed for our Nephrops community, with increased Nephrops stock, there's a more stable or a higher number of higher trophic levels of individuals within the food web. And that's what these plots show. We see that decreasing stock size for cod and whiting with sea surface temperature, an increased stock size of herring when there's higher levels of the large zooplankton index, and also for Nephrops there, higher stock size with more abundant higher trophic levels within the ecosystem. What our goal now is to try and understand these indicators, the causal links. Are they simply correlative? What is the process which is driving this relationship? And to build on them, to understand, is it a linear relationship? Is it a second order? Are there combinations of indicators that can indicate the state of the ecosystem and if it is in a good place for different fish stocks or different stocks? And how we sort of are proposing or coming up with a simple little first step towards incorporating that within fisheries management. We know there's a range of sustainably exploited yield from a fish stock. And using those indicators of the ecosystem condition, we're saying if it's in a good place, if the ecosystem is resilient or if the environmental conditions are strong, maybe you can be at the upper end of that range of sustainable catches. Whereas when you're in poor conditions, maybe you should be more precautionary and move to the lower end. So passing that single species information, stock assessment information in through our ecosystem understanding of the condition, and then also taking into consideration the implications of that on the mixed fishery. So what's the implication of having a high catch advised on cod or a low catch on herring on species that are caught or stocks that are caught together? And that's really the first initial steps toward thinking about how do you incorporate those ecosystem understandings into this annual fisheries management process. But the future, at the minute, we're treating the IRC as a bath. It's got inputs from nutrients, it's got climate change, but it's just a big tank of things swimming about, needing each other, growing and dying. We want to think about these things more spatially. What's the influence of closed areas? Not just XY space, but also the implication of stratification within the IRC, therefore introducing depth and the cycling of nutrients from the seabed to into the water column and vice versa. Look at those developing those series of indicators. So looking at what is the best indicator for different stocks, and how do you even consider these things and understand the causal relationships. Perhaps remove species from the system to look at species range, expansion and contraction, or we could introduce a species, we can remove a species, because we're now in this idea of simulating how the ecosystem responds to that. And also, this provides us not just with the information about cod, about whiting, the things that we assess or haddock, but also starts to say, well, what's going on with everything that we haven't assessed, the prey, and you get an indirect information for all the members of that food web from getting a very clear understanding of the processes within a few key species. And that's kind of our direction of travel. It's not small, but that's where we're moving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, just in terms of your future direction and the ecosystem modeling approach, is there any reason why parasites and pathogens of all species within the wider food web are not considered in terms of biomass and or impacts?
Absolutely not. They can be, because we're modeling energy flow. Very simple metabolic equations are used within the model. So an understanding of metabolics for different classes or species groups could very easily be incorporated within this. At the minute, we're focusing on key issues because we can build in complexity, but this can be expanded, contracted with the key groups. The more we work on it.
So your presentation and the ecosystem-based approach is understandably focused on the offshore finfish species. It's traditionally been managed by, under the CFP. What considerations have been given to Northern Ireland's valuable inshore species such as lobster and brown carp?
Well, and that's really what I was trying to say there about that the unassessed stocks. Because we include all this within the assessment of individual stocks or the trends. We're including dietary information and the reliance on the food web. So by getting a stable, balanced ecosystem with all the members, including bivalves, crabs, and lobsters that are in the system, you can derive their trends. So we may not have the long-term data series that we have because they may not have been the focus, but by getting the balanced system and understanding their contribution to the diet, we can effectively retrofit. We get the backward pattern of their trends over time. So whilst they weren't the focus of this presentation, we get a massive amount of understanding from doing this, not just from the cod or the whiting, but from all parts of the food web.
Thank you. One last specific question is there's a huge amount of effort and data collection going into our scientific advice on single stocks and providing support for fishing opportunities decisions in terms of quotas through ICs. This is an annual process. So would the ecosystem advice also rely on annual data and change each year?
Not necessarily. It's a longer term process. Once you have the simulated model or the simulated system, you can start to talk about identify the phases of the system that you're within, with the phases of the ecosystem. So it would be a much more longer process, a 5 to 10 year process of updating that model, recalibrating, but not necessarily an annual process. You could still use the indicator that you derive from them on an annual basis, but not necessarily the full modeling. So it's a much more longer term understanding of our system.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to invite the other presenters and panel members to join us now, please.
Hi, PJ. It's Adam's here, but I probably don't have camera again.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm going to start this off by posing a question to Matthew. We talked about bivalves and Heather presented bivalves and the ecosystem services we can provide through shellfish aquaculture. What are the scope for expanding shellfish aquaculture in Northern Ireland?
Clearly, the models will give us an indication of the capacity for our base to sustain wider aquaculture. But in practical terms, we are probably moving to the limit of space available, given the other users and other requirements for our bays and coastal waters. But there is clear scope for moving some elements of shellfish aquaculture offshore. And you can see examples from Lyme Bay and elsewhere in Europe. And this in a longer term may prove to be more manageable and acceptable. But there is certainly scope for offshore development. The other development, of course, would be on perhaps higher value species and higher value production rather than mass production.
Thank you, Matt. There's a significant strategic focus on carbon currently and policy focus on carbon. Are there any work on carbon sequestration by bivalves and using it as an offset measure?
Well, it's me or Heather, but perhaps I think, yes, I think the nutrient sequestration and removal by harvesting bivalves is probably just an illustration of what would be the same process for sequestering carbon into bivalve shells, even, for instance, and flesh. And essentially, I think Matt, I think, said earlier on in his talk, it's all about energy flow, and carbon is just part of that model. And I think some of the new work we are taking from the GAIN Horizon 2020 project will certainly be considering that.
Thank you, Matt. Heather, in terms of the expansion of shellfish aquaculture and using shellfish, one of the other environmental issues also to consider is, in terms of healthy environment, is biodiversity and protecting natural systems. So, when you start an aquaculture site, you're clearly affecting that natural system and might lead to habitat loss. But would you consider bivalves and aquaculture to be a better use of habitat availability? How would you deal with that trade-off?
That's something actually that we have looked at. There is a paper on trade-offs, and I suppose through the Horizon 2020 GAIN project, which is green aquaculture intensification in Europe, we're looking at the trade-offs there, because the whole idea of eco-intensification of bivalve aquaculture is that you get more out of the aquaculture that's already existing. So whether that be by changing some of the methods of cultivation, maybe the bags or the location or the orientation of the trestles, you can actually do a bit more about eco-intensifying what we actually have. So you shouldn't have a knock-on effect on conservation species. The importance of that is it takes into account circular economy, valorization of waste. So it's a very holistic approach to the nature-based solution. If you were going to come across where you wanted to expand, the main ecosystem service from commercially cultivated shellfish is food. But in places like Denmark, they're now going towards the idea of using shellfish to mitigate against eutrophication, and those shellfish won't be used for food. But this is just in the final stages. In fact, that's where they're really at that deciding stage now of how they would actually pay the producers not to use their bivalve for food, but to use them as an ecosystem service. The nutrient crediting system that's already existing in the US and in China, where there's much bigger bivalve production than we have, they already have those credits in place. I think, it comes down to societal issues as well. Conservation, it's very high ranking. Ecosystem services from shellfish can help with that. I mean, restoration of shellfish beds is another way to introduce the ecosystem service of bivalves. So, I mean, that's another way of looking at it. So there's lots of different aspects to that. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question, but I have tried.
Thanks very much, Heather. I'm going to jump to Matt here now, and this links to some of the direction I've been trying to push our science into in terms of focusing, moving the focus from indicator and status to actually response and action. So the Baltic Sea, Matt, is an extreme example of a huge amount of monitoring and research funding and great understanding of the system, and has not helped to prevent the catastrophic impact of eutrophication on fisheries. So how can we make sure that Northern Ireland doesn't just monitor change or system change, rather than use that understanding to mitigate anthropogenic impacts or implement measures?
It's a brilliant question, and one that AFBI are brilliantly placed to answer, because because we work backwards from where we are. Because we have this body of work that went from what Heather showed, from looking at the inputs from anthropogenics into the system, how they flow through estuarine systems, depending on those different catchments. The methods to reduce the impact of those through shellfish, through Adam's work in the Living with Water project, which is looking at infrastructure and planning and the actual impacts of human behavior and development on water quality and nutrient introduction. So then, if we get to a point when we're in the open water and we have a working model and we can show the implications of those, and then make advice about, through the simulations, about what would need to be achieved to reduce those, then we can go backwards. It's a feedback loop to then informing the other processes. That's why all this slotting together is, it's not a straight line, but there's feedback through all these projects and all this work.
Thank you, Matt. Adam, do you want to add anything from environmental monitoring side to that question, and then particularly the impact of eutrophication?
I think it's a good question, and it's reflecting on a system where there's, I suppose, going back to that term, lessons learnt, where they've shown that the understanding hasn't been applied. So, as Matt has indicated, we've now accumulated more knowledge, but I think our challenge is to convey that knowledge through our policy leads into actual action. Now, the Baltic obviously is a slightly different system, but in Northern Ireland, there's probably quite a coherent political infrastructure, as in just by virtue of scale, we're able to work together. With the Irish Sea, we've obviously got Welsh, Scottish, and English elements too. So I think to bring an approach, a more coherent approach to managing those inputs and their fates, really comes down to bringing our message across. Those lessons learned from the Baltic, I think, could be very important to persuade DEFRA and DERA, and of course the interests in the Republic of Ireland.
Thank you, Adam. Question related to that, in terms of ecosystem management and this whole holistic approach. Can you maybe provide some comment in terms of where marine spatial planning has a role in ecosystem management, or even ecosystem-based fisheries management, and what closed area, for example, might achieve?
Within the...
Oh, sorry. We'll leave that to Adam. Sorry, Matt.
Okay, so in terms of this is something where our environmental monitoring, our oceanographic platforms, as well as some of our acoustics and the likes of this, we're tying in with our understanding of some of the fishery stocks and looking at what benefits we can add to the protected areas. And I think there's considerable evidence that closed areas really do have that spillover effect. And that's becoming accepted, I think, very much at a societal level. Now, in terms of fisheries, Matt Lundy will be much better to comment in terms of those spillover effects. But I think allowing some, or perhaps more areas to afford actual real protection in terms of exclusion from certain activities is certainly something we need to be considering, but also, of course, any effects of displacement and those would have to be considered. So that's my opinion on the matter anyway.
Thank you, Adam. Unfortunately, we at past 12 already, so we're going to have to end the discussion here. But if there's any outstanding questions we haven't answered, we'll come back to you. And just to make you aware that the previous seminar, webinar, and this one will be available on the AFBI YouTube channel or on the AFBI website. And with this, I'll thank you very much for your interest and participation during this morning's webinar.